So I'm going to talk about Adam and Eve by Albrecht Dürer. This is an engraving, so form is important here as well. Engraving is in some ways similar to a woodcut. It's kind of the opposite of a woodcut. Engraving allows for much more detail than a woodcut, but the advantages are similar in that both can be reproduced. So an engraving is something that once the artist engraves into a metal plate, then they can put ink on it and make many, many copies. And so that allowed people to see art in different places. It also allowed people to study classical art in places where it was not readily accessible. So let's talk about what's going on here. This is, even though it's in the 1500s, is not related to the Protestant Reformation. This is before the Protestant Reformation. And so to me, the artist here, Dürer, is really trying to show the connection of both religious art and humanism or classical art. So we have the biblical figures of Adam and Eve. In the story from the Bible, Adam and Eve are without sin. They're totally pure. And they're in this beautiful garden, the Garden of Eden. However, God tells them, you can eat from any tree except this one tree, the forbidden tree. And Eve is tempted by a serpent, who we see her as a snake wrapped around one of the branches of the tree. And the snake says, go ahead and eat from that tree. God's not really telling you the truth. And if you eat from this tree, you're going to be really smart and know everything like God. And so she does and disobeys God. And that's the first example of sin in the Bible. And Adam and Eve are later thrown out of the garden. So that's a biblical story here, but it's meshed with Renaissance principles. So first of all, let's look at the figures. If you think about the figures, they're kind of a symmetrical stance here. They're kind of direct opposites of each other. They're both in contrapposto stance, so that is a classical element. You can see their bodies, I would say, are very idealized. Like Adam looks really buff and muscular. Eve has what's considered the epitome of feminine beauty at the time, like that softness to her body. And it's thought that these figures that Dürer drew were directly inspired by two classical sculptures. So I'll show you those. So the sculpture on the left is Apollo, and the sculpture on the right is Venus. And so Dürer may not have seen these, but it's thought that there were engravings or copies of these drawn that he had access to, and that he based these figures in his engraving off these two classical sculptures. And if you look at them, I mean, I think they look pretty similar, especially Eve and Venus. The stance and the softness of her body is definitely very similar. And that would, again, show the influence of classical art on Renaissance art. Now, they are contrapposto in their bodies. I mean, he definitely has a clear understanding of the musculature of humans, but I don't think these stances are naturalistic because the figures are fully frontal, but their heads are completely to the side. So this is not a natural pose. I think the artist here is really trying to show off that even though he's from the Northern Renaissance, he understands the principles of the Italian Renaissance, and he understands classical art. And so he's showing that through his depiction of them, even though their stances are not a stance that anyone would ever comfortably stand in. All right, the artist also includes a lot of symbolism here. So we have the snake wrapped around the tree branch, so that's the serpent from the biblical story. We also have a number of animals. So down here, we have an elk, an ox, a rabbit, and a cat. Now, those four animals, the elk, the ox, the rabbit, and the cat, symbolize the four humors. The four humors is like an ancient medical theory. So before people really understood medicine or the human body, people thought that your body was made up of 4 substances, which they called the 4 humors. And they were things like bile, blood, phlegm, and different like fluids in your body. And so people thought if you got sick, it's because one of these things was out of balance. And so you may have heard in medieval times of like bloodletting, where someone's sick and they cut them to release blood and they think they're like getting rid of the toxins or whatever. But actually when you're sick is when you really need all your blood, so that's not really a good theory. Anyways, the 4 humors are how people thought kind of your body stabilized itself. And so the idea here is that before Adam and Eve sinned in the Garden of Eden, their 4 humors were all perfectly in balance because man was still perfect and pure and sinless. And it's only after sin is introduced into the world that we have all these bad things like diseases and death because those 4 humors are out of balance. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about it, but people had different theories like, oh, if you have this illness, it's this particular humor that's out of balance, and here's like a prescription to fix that. So they had different illnesses and ailments that they thought were associated with these different fluids of the body. So those animals represent that idea. Now there's a couple other animals. So down here under Adam's feet, we have a mouse. The mouse often represents Satan. One thing that a lot of art historians think is that because this is before Adam and Eve officially sinned, the cat is not chasing the mouse. This is like a state of purity before kind of those negative things are introduced. And then if we look way up at the top, on the corner, we see a mountain goat standing on top of the mountain in the background. And a goat or a lamb often symbolizes Jesus because Jesus was sacrificed on the cross, just like people previously would give a religious sacrifice of a goat or a lamb. Or you can think of it like Jesus is the scapegoat for humanity. It's kind of a similar idea. All right, over here we also have a parrot. And a parrot can kind of symbolize multiple different things. So people at the time thought that the call of a parrot sounded like a combination of the words Eve and Ave. And so Eve would represent the biblical figure of Eve. Ave would represent the Virgin Mary because like Ave Maria was a Catholic prayer that meant Hail Mary. And so the parrot here kind of represents that people need those 2 things. So it represents Eve, who is a sinful person, and then it represents the Virgin Mary, who was pure and brought Jesus into the world to save humanity from the sins that like Eve had started. So it's kind of a combination representative of Eve and Mary. And then you have this little plaque here. The plaque has the artist's name, and it says that he's from Germany. So it's really just the artist, I guess, kind of being proud of his German heritage and saying, like, even though we're in the Northern Renaissance up here and we're not in Italy, we're still really in tune with what's going on in art, and we understand classical art and Renaissance principles. So the artist is really celebrating his German identity. And so I think that's part of what he's doing here. And then again, just to recap, he's really showing that he, as a Northern Renaissance artist, has adopted some principles of the Italian Renaissance and how his figures are depicted. So he's recalling classical figures, he's looking at perfect proportions, going back to the time of the Greeks and Polyclitus. And after this, I want you to watch the video on engraving and understand how engraving works and add an annotation about that.